Stellar Blade Blood Rain has to prove this franchise is more than hype. The first Stellar Blade proved there is demand. Blood Rain has to prove there is a franchise. That distinction matters because hype can sell one game, hype can push one launch, hype can turn one character into a talking point for months. But hype does not automatically build a franchise. A franchise needs identity. A franchise needs a reason to come back. A franchise needs characters to care after the first wave of attention dies down. And that is the real test for Stellar Blade Blood Rain. The signal here is Blood Rain moving from stylish new action game into long-term IP test. This matters because the first Stellar Blade already won the attention war. That part is not for debate. ShipDub's own press release says Stellar Blade passed 3 million cumulative sales across console and PC, and the PC version passed 1 million sales in 3 days. The PC launch also crossed 180,000 concurrent Steam players, while Steam DB listed all-time peak at 192,078. That is not small hype, that is commercial proof. On the surface, this looks like a simple win. New action game, big sales, strong fan base, flashy combat, controversy, PC launch success, done deal pretty much. But I do not think that is the full read, because the first game proving people would show up is not the same as proving they will stay. That is the difference. That is the pressure point. Stellar Blade proved people would show up. Blood Rain has to prove that they will stay. Here's the surface read. The easy read is that Stellar Blade is already safe. A lot of people will stop there because the game sold well, reviewed well, and built a loud fan base. And to be fair, that take makes sense. The PS5 version sits at an 81 critic score on Metacritic, with a 9.1 user score from over 8,000 user ratings. That means critics were favorable, and players clearly responded to the game. So no, I'm not going to sit here and act like Stellar Blade was some fake success. That would be dumb. The game had results, it had presence, it had energy. It did what a new IP is supposed to do. But that is still the surface version of it. Because a strong first game can still have a soft identity. And that is where the conversation gets more serious. The first game had style, combat, music, character design. It had a kind of presentation that makes people stop scrolling and pay attention. But when the conversation moved past Eve's design, the outfits, the controversy, and the combat, the story and character identity did not hit with the same force. That is a soft spot. That is a part Blood Rain cannot ignore. The Verge's review basically pointed out an issue when it called the game flashy and fun, but said the story and characters were not as interesting. It even called Eve's story unremarkable. Now, you can disagree with that review, that's fine, but the critique points to something real. A game can be fun and still have a character problem. A game can be stylish and still have a story problem. A game can sell well and still lead a franchise question unanswered. That is where Blood Rain comes in. The first game had enough style to carry the weak points. The sequel does not get the same discount. The real issue here is franchise identity. This is what happens when a new IP wins with impact before it fully defines its backbone. You start to see people talk more about the noise around the game than the actual emotional core of the game. Then you get a sequel that has to carry 2 jobs at once. It has to satisfy the people who loved the first game, and it has to prove the series has more to say than look how cool this is. This is harder than it sounds, because the first game had surprise. The sequel has expectation. That is a different game of pressure. I have seen this happen with games before. You play the first one, and it hits because it feels fresh. You forgive the stiff dialogue. You forgive the world building gaps. You forgive the character writing because the combat feels good. And the presentation carries the movement. But by the second game, the grace period is just over. It's done. Now you are asking sharper questions. What is this series really about? Why does this character matter? What separates this world from any other sci-fi action setting? Why should I even care about the next chapter? That is the franchise test. And from what ShipDub has said, it sounds like they know this. Kim Tai said Blood Rain has a clear narrative connection to the first game, but the team also wants it to work as a complete story on its own. That matters. He also said they do not want to rush the release, and that they are taking time to scale up and add depth to the fun and the narrative. That is a line that caught my attention. Not just bigger, not just louder, but depth. That tells me Shift Up is not acting like the first game was flawless. And honestly, that's a good sign. Because the arrogant move would be simple. People bought the first one, so give them more of the same. That is how franchises start getting lazy. That is how sequels become content delivery machines instead of creative evolution. But based on what has been said, Shift Up seems to know that Blood Rain has to carry more weight. The other key detail is Eve. Kim admitted the first game struggled with whether Eve should be a blank slate or more defined personality. He also said the new game is being designed with a more defined character because players can still immerse themselves in someone who has a strong personality. That's crucial because a blank slate can work in some games. But in a stylish character action franchise, the lead character cannot feel like an empty mannequin with just great animations. The lead needs a new point of view. The lead needs presence. The lead needs a combat language, personality, and a reason to exist beyond being placed in the center of cool shots. Shift Up is not acting like the first game was perfect. That is a crucial part. They seem to know that the sequel has to carry more weight. And that brings us to Evie. Because if current reporting is accurate, Blood Rain introduces a new protagonist called Evie and shifts away from the sword-first identity of the first game. Now we are talking about gauntlets, kicks, close quarter combat, a denser cyberpunk city, a different physical rhythm. Games Radar noted that the game looks different from the first one, from Evie's fighting style to the surrounding world. That's not a small change, that's a brand move. And they can either strengthen the franchise or just confuse it. Because if Blood Rain plays too much like the first game, Evie becomes a replacement skin. Just Eve with a different name and a different haircut. But if it plays too differently without purpose, it risks losing the audience that came from the original identity. The sweet spot is giving Evie a combat language that feels new, but still belongs inside Stellar Blade. That is where hand-to-hand combat becomes more than a mechanic. It becomes identity. Sword combat tells you one thing about Eve. Close quarters combat tells you something about Evie. It makes her feel more physical, more direct, more personal. More like somebody who solves problems with their whole body instead of just a weapon. That can separate her immediately. And that matters because character identity is not just dialogue. It's how a character moves. It's how they fight, how they enter a room. It's how the game teaches you to feel them through your hands. If Shift Up gets that right, Evie will not feel like a replacement. She'll feel like an expansion. That is how a franchise grows. Not by copying itself, but by proving it has range. Now let's get to the human cost of all of this. The cost lands on players and fans, and they pay through trust. They pay through attention. They pay through the time they invest in the franchise that may or may not respect that investment. Because players do not just buy games anymore. They buy ecosystems, characters, future potential. They buy into the idea that this world is worth returning to. And over time, if a studio keeps leaning on spectacle while leaving the substance thin, players start to move differently. They still watch the trailer. They still talk about the character designs. They still show up for the discourse. But they do not emotionally commit. That's dangerous. Because trust is not unlimited. Attention is not unlimited. Patience is not unlimited. When people feel like a franchise is more interested in looking premium than becoming meaningful, they eventually start treating it like disposable content. They watch, react, and then they just move on. And that is the last thing Shift Up should want for Stellar Blade, because the market is not soft right now. Shift Up's own investor material points to a harder environment for new titles. Charting is getting harder. Revenue is concentrating around top games. Long-running incumbents dominate attention. That means Blood Rain is not walking to an empty battlefield. It is walking to a crowded market where players already have too much to play in the first place, too much to watch, and too many companies begging for their time. The first Stellar Blade had surprise on its side. The sequel does not. Now the question is not, can Shift Up get people to look? They already answered that. The question is, can Shift Up make people care? That's the real cost. If Blood Rain does not level up the identity, players will still talk about it, but talking is not the same as loyalty. and loyalty is what turns a hit into a franchise. The practical move depends on who this piece is really for, and for this topic, the chosen viewer is the player. And for players, the lesson is simple. Do not judge BloodRayne by hype, judge it by identity. Do not judge it by trailer shots alone, judge it by whether Evie feels like a real lead. Do not judge it by whether the combat looks flashy for 30 seconds. Judge it by whether the combat gives the character a clear voice. Do not judge the city by how pretty the neon looks, judge it by whether the world feels lived in. Because Kim has already said, the city is meant to feel like another protagonist, with inspiration from Asian cities like Hong Kong, Korea, and Japan. That is a strong world-building idea. But now it has to show up in the actual game, not just in interviews, not just in art direction or screenshots, and the way people live, and the way the cities move, and the way the missions flow, and the way the environment tells you what this world values, fears, and hides. That is how a sci-fi city becomes more than scenery. And that is what Stellar Blade BloodRayne needs. Because a mistake will be judging this sequel by the weakest standard. Does it look cool? I mean, of course it does. That's the basic requirement. The smarter move is asking the better question. Does this prove Stellar Blade has a backbone under the hype? That's the real test. And I want to be fair here. Some people will say, why are we acting like Stellar Blade has something to prove? Their first game already sold millions. The PC launch was strong. The user score was high. The fan base is loud. And that is a fair counterpoint. I'm not saying Stellar Blade was only hype. That would be lazy. I'm saying hype helped open the door. BloodRayne has to prove there's enough substance to keep that door open. There's a difference. Because the first game can win because it is new. The second game has to win because it is necessary. That is where the franchise either matures or stalls. And the publishing shift makes that pressure even bigger. VGC reported that BloodRayne would not be a PS5 exclusive like the original, and that shift to accept it is moving to a first-party service model for the next title. That matters, because Stellar Blade is no longer just that stylish Sony-published Korean action game. Now Shift Up has to carry more of the IP under its own power. Marketing, platform strategy, brand identity, long-term franchise direction, that changes the weight of the project. BloodRayne is not just a sequel, it is Shift Up stepping out from under the Sony safety net and saying, this IP can stand on its own. That is a chosen move for players. Do not get distracted by the loudest parts of the conversation. The outfits, controversy, console war noise, platform arguments, Steam numbers, all of that matters to some degree. But none of it answers the deeper question. Can this franchise grow? Can Evie stand on her own? Can the story hit harder? Can the world feel deeper? Can the combat evolve without losing the core? That is the audit. That is the test. Now here's the verdict for this. Stellar Blade won because people looked. BloodRayne has to win because people care. That is not really about whether the sequel has better graphics, bigger cities, or flashier combat. It's about where the Shift Up can turn attention into identity. Because attention got the first game through the door. Identity is what keeps a franchise alive. And once you see that, the whole story becomes clearer. BloodRayne is not just another sequel, it is a proof test. The first game proved demand. The second game has to prove direction. The first game proved style. The second game has to prove substance. The first game proved players were curious. The second game has to prove players are invested. That is the difference between a hit and a franchise. The bottom line is simple. Stellar Blade already proved it can generate hype. BloodRayne has to prove that hype is attached to something durable. Evie needs her own identity. The combat needs to evolve with purpose. The world needs to feel like more than premium sci-fi scenery. And Shift Up needs to show that this IP can stand without depending on novelty, controversy, or the Sony safety net. Because a first game can be carried by surprise. A franchise has to be carried by trust.
Oh, hey, glad you're still here. I've, just finished syncing the next set of files for you. They're right over there on the screen. Take a look and, catch ya in the next one.